Today we're going to cover a broad overview of ancient Roman style. I'm going to, for the most part, skip over the Etruscans, which were contemporaneous with what we've covered in Greece. You can see here at the base of Italy and into Sicily, there are Greek colonies and Greek influences. And the Etruscans, a pastoral people, had their influence on this part of Italy here, right up to the mountains. Eventually, the Latins who lived in this region came down and overtook and then blended with the Etruscans, which is how we got the first Roman Republic. So in 509 to 527 BCE, we have the Roman Republic. It was a conservative government with two consuls elected annually who exercised the executive powers and in times of war commanded armies. There's a lot of complex rules surrounding this, which I'm not going to get into, but that's the stuff of Julius Caesar. Rome and Carthage quarreled over Sicily. So Carthage is located in North Africa. And they quarreled over Sicily. Sicily. Rome was a wealthy, complex society, highly influenced by Hellenistic Greece up through the Augustan age. So we have the first emperor, Caesar Augustus, Caesar's adopted son. And so at this point in the Roman Republic, Romans are valuing highly Greek ideals. And so we see statuary that looks very similar to Roman statuary, such as this piece. And this is a version of Hercules. In the early imperial Rome, though, we start to see particular Roman values and Roman style emerging. Early imperial Rome sees more than 1 million people in the city of Rome. These were including citizens, families, and slaves. Only men could be citizens, but they could be of any class. By the 2nd century, 90% of the residents were foreign, including provincial citizens. The first 200 years of the Roman Empire are referred to as the Pax Romana, because there's 200 years of peace and prosperity. Well, peace is a relative term with Rome, and this begins in 27 BCE. The reign of the Flavian empires saw distinctly Roman dominance over the Greek ideals. A clear example of this is to compare the Greek Parthenon with the Roman Colosseum. So the Parthenon in 5th century BCE perfected the high classic style. Refinements, it represents the refinements the Greeks were making on the archaic temples. And all of these refinements and mathematical calculations reached their peak of perfection in the Greek Parthenon. The vertical and horizontal forces are in equal balance, creating a sense of majesty, simplicity, and complete unity. Whereas the Roman Colosseum, which was built 500 years later in 80 CE, was really emphasized more the gladiatorial games and Rome's interest in power, strength, and display. Imperial Romans placed more emphasis on entertainment and high living than on matters of religion or abstract beauty. Engineering, specifically, is one of Rome's best, most remembered qualities in architecture. The Colosseum itself is a tribute to Roman inventiveness and engineering, since it is an engineering feat as much as it is a piece of architecture. The Romans perfected concrete and vaulted construction to the point where they could construct buildings and bridges and amphitheaters. And viaducts of tremendous size and utility, which is why you're going to watch 2 videos that have to do specifically with how these feats were engineered. In the Colosseum, one can see the piled up layers of arches and the marshaled ring of tunnels that give more spatial variety and flexibility than were ever conceived by the Greeks with their limited post and lintel system. The Greek orders are applied merely as decoration. And so if we move forward and look at the way these, the different column orders are applied to the exterior, they're actually not load-bearing at all. They're decorative, which makes these specifically pilasters, which I'll get to in a little bit. The other specific thing with the Roman Colosseum is they use all three Greek orders. So the base is Doric, the middle is Ionic, and the top is Corinthian. And then we have a ring around the top that is purely constructed of concrete on the top. In this section view of the Colosseum, you can also see the vaulted arches. So an arch is a standalone unit that is load-bearing, but when many arches are put together, you have a vault. And so that's what you're seeing, this ovular vaulting that runs around the perimeter, much like we see in sports stadiums today. And so you can also see all the bleachers where people would sit. The Colosseum could hold, it is estimated, between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators, having an average audience of 65,000. It was used for gladiatorial contests and public spectacles such as mock sea battles at the beginning. This is probably one of my favorite tidbits of history. So if you're looking at the Colosseum here, they've built a little observation deck here, which I don't remember being there when I was there, but it may have been. And so this is essentially where the ground would be, where the gladiatorial events would take place. But this could actually be removed, and then the under parts of the Colosseum, where normally the gladiators were being kept or the wild animals were being kept, later machinery, that would all be flooded with water. This was only really at the beginning of the Colosseum, because as time went on, there was more complex machinery for other spectacles, so they didn't do the naval battle reconstructions. But can you imagine how amazing that must have been? There were also animal hunts, executions, reenactments of famous battles, and dramas based on classical mythology. The building ceased to be used for entertainment in the early medieval era and was later reused for such purposes as housing, workshops, quarters for a religious order, a fortress, a quarry, and a Christian shrine. If we look a little bit closer at the building itself, a little bit more of a detail, you can see the scale of this building in comparison to humans. So you can imagine how well you could have the space to reenact as some kind of battle, usually with elaborate costumes. We have drawings from the period of costumes that were used that would later inspire people such Inigo Jones. The perfection of concrete as a material is what allowed the Romans to build such impressively large structures. If we're looking at this recreation of what Rome would have looked like overhead, you can see the Circus Maximus, which was a place for chariot races, and then many other large-scale public buildings, including baths and the Roman Forum and whatnot. The Romans, knowing that city life was extremely dirty and treacherous, made sure to build public spaces for people to be able to enjoy, use, and improve themselves. Concrete is made of lime, mortar, water, and often volcanic dust. There's two kinds of repeatable structural units that we've seen thus far. Mostly we've been talking about draviated, D-R-A-V-I-A-T-E-D, draviated, which means post and lintel. But what the Romans use is archivated, A-R-C-H-I-V-A-T-E-D, arch, vault, and dome construction. So if we look at the next slide, we will see what I'm talking about. So this is archivated construction. We have an arch, which turns into a larger vault here, a tunnel essentially. Because of stresses, that tunnel needs to be reinforced with what we call a buttress. So this is a thickened wall that can take the strain of the tensile force of the arch pushing down into the walls. This will become later, because this is a basis of construction using a buttress. Much later in the Gothic period, we're going to be seeing what's called the flying buttress, where it not only buttresses the bottom, but then reaches up towards the top of the building to support upper structures. You can also see where two tunnels meet. This is where we get a groin vault. And so you can see these tunnels meeting at a point in the center, but it's all curved arches. When the buttress that we have at the corner of this groin vault is called a pier, P-I-E-R. And so this way you would be able to have a gathering space in the middle of two corridors. You'll see this in the video that specifically talks about Roman basilica. There's two other pieces of architectural terminology that I'd like you to be aware of. First is the Roman use of engaged columns. So engaged columns are structurally load-bearing, but they are also incorporated with a wall. It's embedded in a wall, partially projecting from the surface of the wall, sometimes defined as a semi or three-quarter detached. Engaged columns are rarely found in classical Greek architecture, and then only in exceptional cases. But in Roman architecture, they exist in abundance, most commonly embedded in the cella walls, as we see here, of some of their buildings. The other architectural term I want you to know is what we saw in the Colosseum, which is called a pilaster. So a pilaster, P-I-L-A-S-T-E-R, is an architectural element in classic architecture used to give the appearance of a supporting column and to articulate an extent of the wall with only ornamental function. It consists of a flat surface raised from the main wall surface, usually treated as though it were a column with a capital at the top and a plinth at the base at the bottom. In contrast to a pilaster, an engaged column or a buttress can support the structure of the wall or roof above, whereas a pilaster cannot. This is the ground plan of the video you're going to watch that has to do with the Basilica Ulpia. So this is the ground plan of that. So this was a gathering place, social structures I was talking about. The specific shape of this is going to carry on into Christian architecture specifically. This is one of the first places that Christians, once they are no longer persecuted, go to claim as a gathering place for their burgeoning religion. So we've got an altar at both sides of the apse, and you may know the word apse from cathedrals. So there would be an altar at either end, and it would also be a space. The Romans used it for judicial cases and whatnot. So there would be a tribunal for judges and assessors here at the end of the apse. But it could also be, it was a multifunction space, so it could also be used for certain public religious rites or honors or general meetings and whatnot. Basilicas were essentially just a part of the structure of the city. Romans also, based on their multiple military campaigns, had a strong sense of the way that military camps should be laid out for effectiveness, and this carried over to their city planning. In general, they created what we now take for granted as far as the city block construction. And so there would be two main via principas, so two roads that would go through each city. And that would be separated by different blocks. There would be planning for where the fountains would go, because people would need to go get water for the most part from these fountains. They had not just a decorative purpose, but also a practical one. This would be aligned with the gates to get in and out of the city, as well as the larger public spaces would be aligned with where the aqueduct would come into the city. So there would be a water cistern there, as well as any baths that would be present, in larger social structures such as the amphitheater. So these cities were laid out in a very careful manner, but it was taken from military expertise. Romans were also the first to build multi-story apartment buildings. So much of society lived in these apartment buildings. The better ones would involve 12 rooms on 2 floors with a bottom floor for shops. The poorest people would live in tall apartment buildings, 4 to 9 stories tall. The poorest people would live on the highest floors because it would be hotter and harder to get up to them, and carrying the necessities up, those several flights would be difficult. They were sometimes crowded. They had poor lighting, bad ventilation, and there was a constant threat of fires. Particularly the fire that Nero was most known for. Building codes were put into place after much of the city burned down. Think of these as tenements at turn of the century in New York. They would be fairly similar living conditions, except for potentially a lot worse. But that would be a parallel to compare this to. Wealthier people lived in, so the aristocracy in particular lived in townhouses when they were in the city, but these townhouses would have much more space, and they would also have a lot of air, light, and potentially gardens. So in this cut through, we see that, especially because of the climate of Italy being as mild and beautiful as it is, there would be a garden space here that would also be a space where people would spend time, as well as an opening in the roof that would collect water into a pool. This would also potentially have a space for shops as well. So again, here's the atrium, and this is where we get the word atrium from. There would be bedrooms, and the garden. So here we're seeing that just in a slightly different way. This is a different version of that. The rooms in a Roman house were all meant to be public spaces. There's a resource that you're going to engage with that talks a little bit about the different social and moral standards of the Roman Empire and their private homes. The private rooms were really just more for sleeping and other activities such as prayer and whatnot. For the most part, most of the rooms in the house were dedicated to be public leisure spaces and entertainment spaces. This is a ground plan of one of the larger homes that was discovered in Herculaneum. This is the House of Faun. And you can see all the different multiple small rooms, and they are very small, I will say. They're impressively small. And some of the fact that there's much larger spaces than that people would really spend their time in. This is a flyover of a maquette of the House of Faun. And this is a sort of front view of what they think it really would have looked like at the time. Again, we've got this opening in the ceiling with a pool on the ground here, going through this nice open air space. And they must have been extremely pleasant to live in. Here is the country house. So most wealthy citizens not only had their urban dwellings, but they also had country manses to go to. So this is a country villa near Pompeii that we have. You can see that it has much more space to spread out, as most country residences do. It had a bakery, had its own baths, had even a fermenting yard specifically. So take a little time, look at this. So look at this ground plan and layout of this space. The interiors of Roman homes were extremely well decorated. Most of the evidence we have of these that was preserved really came from Pompeii and Herculaneum. Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 BCE. And it was excavated in the 1790s at the time of Napoleon. And that is a large reason why we see the resurgence of Greek and Roman fashion in neoclassic style. So if we're looking at the interior of this building, we're seeing lots of draped fabric. We're seeing elaborate paintings, very elaborate paintings. They spent a lot of time covering their walls, not just with stucco, but with layers of specific architectural compounds to create hard, protected walls that would be a perfect surface for decoration. We have a lot of elaborate frescoes, so very, very detailed paintings on the interiors, and many mosaics. So this is a vertical wall mosaic of a niche in Herculaneum between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE. And even the floors were elaborately decorated with mosaics. So here's a few examples. You can see that the tiles are highly geometric in their creation. And then there's usually central pieces that have that depict certain things based on the homeowner. Here is your chair for the period. This is technically a sofa, not a chair, but this is an imperial sofa from between the 1st and 2nd century AD. It's made of wood, bone, and glass. There's glass inlay in it, and you can see it also comes with a footstool as well. The last architectural example I'm going to show you is the Celis Library in Ephesus, located in the ancient city of Anatolia in modern-day Turkey. So in this example, you're seeing how the Romans took the Greek orders of columns and did their own thing to a degree with this building. It was built in honor of the Roman senator Tiberius Julius Celsus, hence its name, and it was completed between 114 and 117 CE by Celsus's son Gaius. The library is one of the most impressive buildings in the Roman Empire, and it was built to store 12,000 scrolls and to serve as a mausoleum for Celsus, who was buried in a crypt beneath the library in a decorated marble sarcophagus. The Library of Celsus was the 3rd largest library in the ancient world behind Alexandria and Pergamum. The interior of the library is destroyed supposedly by an earthquake in 262 CE, although other evidence points to a fire during a Gothic invasion that same year, and the facade was destroyed by another earthquake in the 10th or 11th century. It laid in ruins for centuries until the facade was re-erected by archaeologists between 1970 and 1978. Some of the features of this facade are going to be carried over into Romanesque and specifically the Renaissance. So we're seeing these pediments at the top here, curved and then pointed and then curved again. This will come back. You can also see the columns are stacked in ways that we don't really see in Greek architecture necessarily. And the Romans are really combining multiple motifs to create something completely new. It's also extremely intricately decorated. It's a little hard to tell from a distance looking at the reconstruction, but if you get a little closer here to some detail, you're really seeing these different kinds of intricate moldings. And so here's this egg and dart. We're seeing friezes that have organic carvings to them. We're seeing complex moldings meeting up with one another. We see the Corinthian, the extremely decorative Corinthian columns and embedded statues in alcoves. And so this is the profiles of facade plaster elements. Okay, so these are terms for commonly used. Commonly used moldings. So you'll need to memorize these based on the pictures. So take a look. They'll be extremely important later on because these are what are used over and over again throughout history. These are some of our most common moldings that every theater student should be aware of. With that, please return to the lesson page. Watch any of the videos or resources assigned there before we move on to Roman costume.